The banker ignored him until he discovered he was the patron funding it all. The autumn rain hammered against the grimy windows of the First National Bank of Birmingham as Edward Carmichael adjusted his silk tie for the third time that morning. The marble floors gleamed under the electric chandeliers, a stark contrast to the soot-stained streets outside where factory workers trudged through puddles on their way to another day of backbreaking labor. Edward prided himself on existing above such squalor, his polished Oxford shoes never touching anything more common than Persian rugs and Italian marble. At 42, Edward had clawed his way up from a clerk's position to senior vice president, and he wore his authority like a perfectly tailored suit. His corner office overlooked the industrial heart of Birmingham, where smokestacks pierced the gray sky like accusing fingers. From his leather chair, he could survey his domain, a world where money flowed according to his whims, where a signature could make or break fortunes, where men in expensive suits spoke in hushed tones about investments that would reshape the city. The morning had been routine, approving loans for steel magnates, denying credit to small business owners who couldn't meet his increasingly rigid standards, and reviewing the quarterly reports that showed the bank's growing influence over Birmingham's industrial landscape. Edward took particular pleasure in these moments of power, when desperate men would sit across from his mahogany desk, hat in hand, begging for financial salvation that only he could provide or deny. His secretary, Miss Thompson, knocked precisely at 11 o'clock, a timing so regular it had become part of the bank's rhythm. "Mr. Carmichael, the morning appointments are complete. Shall I bring your tea?" Her voice carried the crisp efficiency he demanded from all his staff. "Yes, and make sure it's the Earl Grey from Harrods. None of that local rubbish." Edward didn't look up from his papers, a habit that reinforced the hierarchy he so carefully maintained. Through his office window, he watched the morning crowd disperse as workers disappeared into factories and warehouses. The sight filled him with satisfaction. These were the people who needed his bank, who depended on the financial ecosystem he helped control. They were predictable, manageable, and most importantly, profitable. The brass clock on his desk chimed 11:30 when Miss Thompson returned, carrying a silver tray with bone china that bore the bank's coat of arms. "Sir, there's a gentleman in the lobby asking to speak with you. He doesn't have an appointment." Edward's eyebrows furrowed as he accepted the delicate cup. "What kind of gentleman? Does he look like he belongs in a bank of our caliber?" The question carried the weight of years spent cultivating an exclusive clientele, men whose names appeared in society pages and whose handshakes could move mountains of capital. Miss Thompson hesitated, her usual composure wavering slightly. "Well, sir, he's rather plainly dressed. Working clothes, I'd say. Coal dust on his boots. But he insisted it was urgent business regarding accounts." A laugh escaped Edward's lips, bitter and sharp. "Coal dust? In my bank, Miss Thompson? Surely you can handle such matters without disturbing me. Direct him to one of the junior clerks. Perhaps they can help him open a savings account for his weekly wages." But as he spoke, something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. The way Miss Thompson had hesitated, the uncertainty in her voice. It was unlike her. She had worked at the bank for 15 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to sort the wheat from the chaff with a single glance. "Sir, he mentioned specific account numbers, large ones, and he seemed to know quite a bit about our recent acquisitions in the munitions district." Miss Thompson's voice had dropped to almost a whisper, as if the very words carried weight that could crush the carefully constructed order of their world. Edward set down his teacup with deliberate precision, the china making a sharp click against the saucer. Account numbers, large ones. The munitions district acquisitions were confidential, known only to the bank's board of directors and a handful of investors whose identities were protected by layers of legal documentation and deliberate obscurity. What exactly did he say? The question came out sharper than intended, and Edward noticed his fingers had unconsciously begun drumming against the desktop, a nervous habit he thought he'd conquered years ago. "He said to tell you that Thomas Whitmore was here to discuss the Birmingham Industrial Development Fund. And, sir," Miss Thompson paused, as if weighing whether to continue, "he knew about the Garrison Industries loan, the one we processed last month under special circumstances." The drumming stopped. The Garrison Industries loan was so confidential that only 3 people in the bank knew the full details: Edward, the bank president, and the mysterious investor who had provided the capital. The loan had funded the expansion of a munitions factory that was rapidly becoming one of Birmingham's most profitable enterprises, but the true ownership remained hidden behind a labyrinth of shell companies and proxy investors. Edward stood slowly, his chair rolling back on silent wheels. Through his window, the industrial landscape of Birmingham stretched endlessly, a testament to the kind of power that money could wield when properly directed. But for the first time in years, he felt a flutter of uncertainty in his chest. "Send him up," he said finally, his voice steady despite the questions racing through his mind. "And Miss Thompson, clear my schedule for the next hour." As his secretary's footsteps faded down the marble hallway, Edward straightened his jacket and walked to the window. Below, the city hummed with activity. Workers, merchants, industrialists, all moving according to patterns he had helped establish. But somewhere in that vast machinery of commerce and power, there were gears he didn't control, forces he didn't fully understand. The coal dust on the man's boots suddenly seemed less like a sign of poverty and more like evidence of something far more significant. In Birmingham, coal dust could mean many things: honest labor, industrial power, or the kind of deep connections to the city's underground economy that respectable bankers preferred to ignore. As he waited for Thomas Whitmore to arrive, Edward realized he was about to discover which kind of coal dust had walked into his pristine world. The elevator's brass gate clanged shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the marble corridors of the First National Bank. Edward Carmichael stood behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, projecting the kind of authority that had intimidated countless supplicants over the years. The afternoon light filtered through his office windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that had cost more than most Birmingham workers earned in a year. When the knock came, it was neither tentative nor demanding, simply 3 measured raps that suggested neither desperation nor arrogance. "Enter," Edward called, his voice carrying the practiced tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The door opened to reveal a figure that immediately challenged every assumption Edward had constructed. Thomas Whitmore was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair that showed traces of premature gray, and eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. His clothes were indeed simple: wool trousers that had seen honest wear, a white shirt that was clean but far from new, and a dark jacket that belonged in a working man's wardrobe rather than a banker's office. But there was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his stride, that made Edward reassess his initial dismissal. This wasn't the shuffling gait of a man intimidated by wealth and power. Instead, Thomas Whitmore walked like someone who owned whatever space he occupied, regardless of its material grandeur. "Mr. Carmichael." Thomas's voice carried a slight Birmingham accent, softened by what sounded like years of careful cultivation. "Thank you for seeing me." He didn't offer his hand or wait for permission to sit. Instead, he settled into one of the leather chairs facing Edward's desk with the kind of ease that suggested he'd occupied far more impressive seats than this one. Edward remained standing, using height as a psychological weapon. "Mr. Whitmore, is it? My secretary mentioned you had questions about accounts. I should inform you that our clients value discretion above all else." A slight smile played at the corners of Thomas's mouth. "Discretion? Yes, I imagine they do." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a slim leather folder, placing it carefully on the mahogany surface between them. "Especially when it comes to the Birmingham Industrial Development Fund." The folder seemed to radiate significance, like a dark star pulling Edward's attention inexorably toward it. He had helped establish that fund 18 months ago, a complex financial instrument that had channeled enormous amounts of capital into Birmingham's expanding industrial sector. The fund's true beneficiaries remained carefully hidden, their identities protected by legal structures so intricate that even Edward didn't fully understand all the connections. "I'm afraid I can't discuss confidential financial arrangements," Edward said, though his eyes remained fixed on the folder. "Perhaps you could explain your interest in these matters." Thomas leaned back in his chair, entirely at ease despite the intimidating surroundings. "My interest is quite simple, Mr. Carmichael. I want to ensure that my investments are being managed properly." He paused, allowing the words to settle like dust on expensive furniture. You see, I have a substantial stake in Birmingham's future, more substantial than you might imagine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Edward felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Your investments. Mr. Whitmore, I handle accounts for some of the most influential men in England. If you were a client of this magnitude, I would certainly—" "Remember me?" Thomas finished quietly. "Yes, I imagine you would. But then again, I've always preferred to work through intermediaries. It keeps things simpler." Edward finally sat down, his legs suddenly feeling less steady than they had moments before. The leather folder seemed to mock him from across the desk, promising answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. "The Garrison Industries expansion," Thomas continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Excellent return on investment, wouldn't you say? Though I understand the loan terms were rather unusual, favorable to the borrower, minimal documentation required, and guaranteed by an anonymous benefactor." The blood drained from Edward's face. The Garrison Industries loan had been processed under extraordinary circumstances, with capital provided by an investor who remained hidden behind layers of legal protection. Edward had assumed the mysterious benefactor was one of Birmingham's established industrial families, someone with old money and older connections who preferred to avoid public attention. "How do you know about—" Edward began, then stopped himself. Admitting knowledge of the loan's details would be a breach of client confidentiality, but denying it seemed increasingly futile. Thomas opened the leather folder with deliberate care, revealing documents that made Edward's heart skip several beats. Bank statements, investment records, legal agreements, all bearing the signatures and seals that Edward recognized as legitimate. But the names on these documents told a story that reorganized everything he thought he knew about Birmingham's financial landscape. "The munitions contracts," Thomas said, pointing to a particular set of figures. "In the steel mill acquisitions, the shipping company purchases, the warehouse district development, all funded through various channels, all ultimately traceable to the same source." His finger moved across the papers like a conductor directing an orchestra of numbers and names. "All funded by me." Edward stared at the documents, his trained eye automatically verifying their authenticity, even as his mind reeled from their implications. The sums involved were staggering, millions of pounds flowing through carefully constructed financial channels, supporting an industrial empire that stretched far beyond Birmingham's traditional boundaries. "That's impossible," he whispered, though the evidence spread before him suggested otherwise. "I would have known. The bank's board would have known. We conduct thorough due diligence on all major investors." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Edward glimpsed something beneath the quiet exterior. Not malice, but a kind of patient amusement, like a teacher watching a slow student finally grasp a complex equation. "Mr. Carmichael, how do you think due diligence works when the subject of that diligence owns the companies conducting the investigation?" Thomas's voice remained conversational, but each word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "How do you verify the credentials of a man who helped establish the criteria for verification?" The office seemed to shrink around Edward as the implications cascaded through his understanding. Every major industrial development in Birmingham over the past 2 years, every significant loan his bank had processed, every investment opportunity that had seemed too good to refuse, all of it suddenly appeared in a new light, like a photograph developing in a dark room to reveal shapes that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. Outside the window, Birmingham's industrial skyline looked different now, no longer a testament to the power of legitimate banking, but evidence of something far more complex and carefully orchestrated. The silence in Edward Carmichael's office stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of revelation. Through the tall windows, Birmingham's industrial landscape continued its eternal dance of smoke and steam, but within the confines of the mahogany-paneled room, time seemed suspended. Edward stared at the documents spread across his desk, his trained banker's eye tracing connections he had never seen before, patterns that revealed a hidden architecture of power that had been operating beneath his very nose. Thomas Whitmore remained perfectly still in his chair, watching Edward's face as understanding dawned like a cold winter morning. There was no cruelty in his observation, but there was an absolute patience that suggested he had witnessed this particular awakening many times before, in many different contexts, with many different men who had believed themselves to be the architects of their own success. "The First National Bank of Birmingham," Thomas said quietly, breaking the silence with words that fell like stones into still water. Established 1887. Capitalized initially with funding from the Cromwell Industrial Trust. Do you know who established the Cromwell Industrial Trust, Mr. Carmichael? Edward's throat felt dry as desert sand. The Cromwell Industrial Trust was legendary in Birmingham's financial circles. Old money, older connections, the kind of institutional power that had shaped the city's development for generations. The trust had been one of the bank's founding investors, providing the capital that had allowed First National to compete with London's established financial houses. The Cromwell family, Edward managed to say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Old industrial money. Textiles, then steel, then diversified holdings. Thomas nodded approvingly, like a professor acknowledging a correct but incomplete answer. Indeed, and the Cromwell Industrial Trust is managed by Whitmore Holdings, which is owned by… He paused, allowing Edward to complete the equation. By you, Edward whispered, and the words seemed to echo off the office walls like an accusation. By me, Thomas confirmed. Which makes me, through a rather elegant series of legal structures, one of the founding investors in this very bank. In fact, Mr. Carmichael, you could say that I helped pay for this office, this desk, even that rather expensive Persian rug you're so fond of. Edward felt as if the floor were tilting beneath his feet. Every major decision he had made, every loan he had approved, every investment strategy he had implemented, all of it had been supported by capital that ultimately traced back to the quietly dressed man sitting across from him. The irony was devastating. He had spent years building what he thought was his own financial empire, only to discover he had been a tenant in someone else's castle. But why? Edward's voice cracked slightly as he asked the question. Why remain hidden? Why not simply take your place on the board, assert direct control? Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. Because, Mr. Carmichael, direct control is often the least effective form of power. When people know they're being controlled, they resist. When they believe they're making their own decisions, they cooperate. You've been an excellent manager of my interests precisely because you believed they were your own. The admission stung more than Edward had expected. He had prided himself on his independence, his ability to make hard decisions without interference from board members or outside investors. To learn that this independence had been an illusion, that he had been dancing to music he couldn't even hear, was a blow to his fundamental understanding of himself. The other banks, Edward said suddenly, grasping for some solid ground. Surely the other financial institutions in Birmingham operate independently. Thomas's smile was neither cruel nor kind, simply factual. Merchants Trust received a substantial capital injection last year to fund their expansion into industrial lending. The source of that capital was Blackwood Investments, which is owned by a subsidiary of Cromwell Industrial Trust. He paused to let this sink in. Birmingham Commercial Bank's recent acquisition of 3 smaller institutions was financed through the Industrial Development Fund we discussed earlier. Their board believes the funding came from a consortium of London investors. Edward's mind raced through the implications. If Thomas controlled or significantly influenced the major banking institutions in Birmingham, then he effectively controlled the flow of capital throughout the entire region. Industrial development, commercial expansion, even small business loans, all of it flowing according to patterns established by the man in working clothes sitting in his office. You own the city, Edward said, and it wasn't a question. I don't own it, Thomas corrected gently. I simply understand how it works. Birmingham's prosperity depends on coal, steel, and manufacturing. Those industries require capital, infrastructure, and coordination. I provide the capital, influence the infrastructure development, and facilitate the coordination. The result is a city that prospers, workers who have jobs, and businesses that generate returns for their investors, and enormous profits for yourself, Edward added, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Thomas nodded without shame. Indeed, but consider the alternative, Mr. Carmichael. What happens when industrial development lacks coordination? When capital flows according to individual whims rather than comprehensive planning, you get boom and bust cycles, worker unrest, business failures, and economic instability. My approach provides stability, growth, and prosperity for everyone involved. Edward looked out at Birmingham's skyline with new eyes. The coordinated expansion he had observed over the past years, new factories appearing in strategic locations, infrastructure improvements that seemed to anticipate rather than respond to need, business developments that complemented rather than competed with each other. All of it suddenly made sense as part of a grand design rather than fortunate coincidence. "The police," Edward said suddenly, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Inspector Morrison's recent promotion, the increased security around the industrial district, the new station house near the munitions factories. The Birmingham police force has been very cooperative in maintaining order, Thomas agreed, especially since their pension fund began investing in some very reliable industrial securities. Amazing how much more motivated officers become when their retirement depends on the continued prosperity of the businesses they're protecting. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The scope of Thomas's influence extended beyond finance into the very institutions that maintained law and order in the city. It was a level of power that made even the wealthiest industrialists seem like children playing with toys. "And what do you want from me?" Edward asked finally, abandoning any pretense of being an equal in this conversation. Thomas's expression softened slightly, showing what might have been genuine respect. "I want you to continue doing exactly what you've been doing, Mr. Carmichael. You're an excellent banker, and this institution has thrived under your management. The only difference is that now you understand the true nature of your position. And if I refuse, if I decide I don't want to be a puppet in your show—" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with apparent seriousness. "Then you would be free to leave, of course. Your pension would be generous, your references impeccable. You might even find a position with one of the London banks, though I suspect you would find their operations rather limited compared to what you've grown accustomed to here." The implicit message was clear. Edward could leave, but he would be leaving behind not just his position, but his entire world, stepping down from a stage where he had played a significant role to become just another actor in someone else's smaller production. The grandfather clock in Edward's office marked the passage of minutes with mechanical precision, each tick echoing in the space between revelation and decision. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Birmingham's industrial quarter, where factory smokestacks released their daily tribute to progress and prosperity. But inside the mahogany-paneled sanctuary that Edward had considered his domain, the familiar rhythms of power and certainty had been permanently disrupted. Thomas Whitmore remained seated with unnerving composure, his working man's clothes a stark contrast to the expensive furnishings that surrounded him. The documents spread across Edward's desk seemed to pulse with significance, each page representing another thread in a web of influence, so vast and intricate that Edward was only beginning to comprehend its true scope. "There's something else," Thomas said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw another slim folder. "Something that directly concerns your future, Mr. Carmichael." Edward's stomach clenched. The revelations of the past hour had already shattered his understanding of his place in Birmingham's financial hierarchy. What additional truth could possibly remain to be uncovered? Thomas opened the new folder to reveal a single sheet of official letterhead bearing the seal of the Bank of England. Edward recognized it immediately, the kind of document that could reshape entire financial institutions with a few carefully chosen words. "The Bank of England has been conducting a review of regional banking practices," Thomas explained, his voice maintaining its conversational tone despite the gravity of his words, "particularly regarding the documentation and oversight of large industrial loans. They've expressed some concerns about certain irregularities in the Birmingham banking sector." Edward's blood turned to ice water. A Bank of England investigation into irregular lending practices could destroy not just his career, but potentially result in criminal charges. The financial arrangements he had processed over the past years, many of them involving the complex web of companies that he now knew belonged to Thomas, might appear highly suspicious to investigators unfamiliar with their true nature. "The Garrison Industries loan, for instance," Thomas continued, "appears on paper to have been approved with minimal documentation and guaranteed by an entity that exists only as a legal shell. From an investigator's perspective, it might look like the kind of arrangement designed to hide money laundering or fraud. "But you just told me you were the guarantor," Edward protested, his voice rising slightly. "And these arrangements were legitimate business transactions." "Indeed they were," Thomas agreed. "But try explaining that to a Bank of England investigator who has no access to the complete financial records, who can't see the full scope of the industrial development these loans supported. From their limited perspective, these transactions look highly irregular, possibly criminal." Edward felt the walls of his carefully constructed world closing in around him. The very success he had been so proud of, the complex financial arrangements that had seemed so clever and profitable, now appeared as potential evidence of wrongdoing that could destroy his reputation and his freedom. "However," Thomas added, and Edward heard in that single word the possibility of salvation, "there is another perspective from which these transactions appear entirely legitimate and beneficial." Thomas reached into the folder again and withdrew a thick document bound in expensive leather. The cover bore the gold-embossed seal of a London legal firm whose reputation was legendary throughout England's financial circles. "This is a comprehensive audit of Birmingham's industrial development over the past 3 years," Thomas explained. "Conducted by Worthington, Blackwood and Associates at the request of the Birmingham Industrial Development Council. It documents the remarkable coordination and success of the region's economic growth, particularly praising the innovative financial arrangements that made such rapid expansion possible." Edward stared at the document, understanding beginning to dawn. "You commissioned this audit?" "The Birmingham Industrial Development Council commissioned this audit," Thomas corrected with a slight smile. "Though you're quite right that I had some influence over the decision. The audit concludes that the banking practices employed in Birmingham represent a model of regional financial cooperation that other cities might well emulate, and this audit would be available to Bank of England investigators, if they requested it, certainly, along with supporting documentation from the various businesses that have benefited from Birmingham's coordinated development approach, testimonials from workers whose jobs were created by these innovative financing arrangements, economic data showing the remarkable stability and growth that resulted from this cooperative model." Edward understood the choice being presented to him with crystalline clarity. He could resist, attempt to expose Thomas's hidden empire, and likely find himself destroyed by an investigation that would paint him as a corrupt banker involved in fraudulent schemes. Or he could accept his role as a manager within Thomas's larger organization and enjoy the protection that came with being a valued member of a successful enterprise. "You've thought of everything," Edward said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice despite his circumstances. "I've had time to consider various contingencies," Thomas replied modestly, "but I want to be clear about something. Mr. Carmichael, this isn't a threat. You've been an excellent banker because you're intelligent, ethical, and dedicated to your profession. I have no interest in compromising those qualities. I simply want you to continue being excellent at what you do, with a fuller understanding of the context in which you're operating." Edward walked to his window, looking out at the city that he now understood was shaped by forces far more sophisticated than he had ever imagined. The industrial coordination he had attributed to fortunate coincidence was actually the result of careful planning. The financial stability he had credited to his own expertise was actually supported by vast resources he had never suspected. "The workers," Edward said suddenly, thinking of the thousands of men and women who depended on Birmingham's industrial prosperity. "What happens to them if I choose not to cooperate?" Thomas joined him at the window, standing close enough that Edward could smell the faint scent of coal smoke that clung to his simple clothes. "The same thing that happens to any complex system when one of its components fails," Thomas said quietly. "The system adapts, finds a replacement component, and continues operating. The workers keep their jobs, the factories keep producing, and Birmingham keeps prospering. The only question is whether you want to be part of that prosperity or observe it from the outside." Edward understood that this was not really a choice between good and evil, but between being a conscious participant in a system that was already operating or remaining an unconscious tool of forces he couldn't control. The power he had thought he wielded had always been an illusion, but the opportunity to exercise real influence, even as a junior partner in a larger enterprise, was being offered to him. "What would change?" he asked. "Very little, initially," Thomas replied. "You would continue managing the bank's operations as you have been, The only difference is that you would occasionally receive guidance about strategic directions that would benefit our broader objectives. And of course, you would have access to information that would help you make even better decisions than you have been making. And my staff would continue their careers much as they have been, though they might find advancement opportunities opening up more frequently. Success tends to create opportunities for everyone involved. Edward made his decision with the same careful deliberation that had characterized his best banking choices. It was not a surrender, but a recognition of reality, an acceptance of a role that would allow him to exercise meaningful power within a larger framework. "I understand," he said finally, "and I accept." 6 months later, Edward Carmichael stood in the same office that had witnessed his transformation from unwitting servant to conscious participant in Thomas Whitmore's carefully orchestrated empire. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been recently cleaned by staff, who now moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood their work served a larger purpose. The Persian rug remained unchanged, but Edward no longer saw it as a symbol of his personal success. Instead, it represented the attention to detail that characterized an organization where nothing was left to chance. The quarterly report spread across his mahogany desk told a story of remarkable prosperity. Birmingham's industrial output had increased by 37% over the past 6 months. Unemployment had fallen to historic lows, and the city's financial institutions were processing record levels of investment capital. What had once seemed like fortunate coincidence now revealed itself as the natural result of sophisticated coordination between banking, industry, and civic planning. Miss Thompson entered precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying the silver tea service that had become one of the small rituals Edward continued to cherish. But their morning routine now included an additional element, a sealed envelope containing the day's strategic guidance from what Edward had learned to think of as the coordination office. "Good morning, Mr. Carmichael," Miss Thompson said, settling the tea service on his desk with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Morrison from the police department called to confirm the security arrangements for tomorrow's delegation visit, and the mayor's office sent their appreciation for the bank's support of the new technical college funding." Edward nodded, opening the sealed envelope as he had each morning for the past months. The coordination office's communications were always brief and precise, outlining opportunities that would benefit both the bank's interests and Birmingham's broader development. Today's guidance concerned a proposal from a Sheffield steel company seeking to establish a manufacturing facility in Birmingham's expanding industrial district. The proposal was precisely the kind of opportunity that Edward would have found appealing, even without guidance. Solid financing requirements, proven management, and strong potential returns. But the coordination office's analysis revealed additional factors. The Sheffield company's technology would complement existing Birmingham manufacturers. Their workforce requirements would utilize skilled workers displaced by recent factory automation, and their supply chain needs would benefit 3 other businesses in which Thomas maintained interests. What might have appeared to an outside observer as a fortunate convergence of beneficial circumstances was actually the result of careful orchestration, with multiple parties benefiting from arrangements none of them fully understood. Edward's phone rang, interrupting his review of the morning's correspondence. Miss Thompson's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, Inspector Morrison is here to see you. He says it's regarding the Industrial District Security Assessment." "Send him in," Edward replied, settling back in his leather chair with the comfortable authority of a man who understood his place in a larger design. Inspector Morrison entered with the measured stride of a police officer who had learned to navigate the complex relationships between law enforcement and legitimate business interests. At 55D, Morrison had supervised Birmingham's police force through the transition from a collection of individual industrial operations to the coordinated economic powerhouse the city had become. "Good morning, Edward," Morrison said, accepting the chair that Edward indicated. "I wanted to update you on the security arrangements for the Sheffield delegation. Everything's in place for tomorrow's site visit." "Excellent. Any concerns?" Morrison shook his head. "Quite the contrary. The Sheffield people are impressed with Birmingham's stability. They've commented several times on how well coordinated everything seems here compared to other cities they've considered." Edward smiled, understanding Morrison's meaning. The Sheffield Steel Company had been evaluating potential locations for their expansion for 8 months, visiting industrial centers throughout England. But Birmingham's presentation had been seamless. City officials who understood exactly what information would be most relevant, bank representatives prepared with precisely the right financing options, and civic leaders who could speak knowledgeably about infrastructure development that seemed designed specifically for their needs. "Inspector," Edward said, "you've been working with the coordination office longer than I have. Do you ever miss the old way of doing things?" Morrison considered the question seriously. "You mean when every decision required endless meetings, when competing interests meant that good projects sometimes failed for political reasons, when we spent more time managing conflicts than solving problems?" Edward nodded. "Not for a moment," Morrison replied firmly. "My job is to maintain order and protect Birmingham's citizens. The coordination approach means that industrial development proceeds smoothly, workers have stable employment, and potential problems are addressed before they become actual problems. From a law enforcement perspective, it's remarkably effective." Edward understood Morrison's perspective completely. The inspector's pension fund investments had certainly benefited from Birmingham's industrial growth, but more importantly, Morrison was a professional who appreciated systems that worked efficiently and predictably. The phone rang again, and Miss Thompson's voice announced, "Sir, Mr. Whitmore is here to see you." Edward felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that Thomas's visits always generated. Over the past months, these meetings had evolved from the earth-shaking revelation of their first encounter to collaborative sessions where Edward could provide insights based on his detailed knowledge of Birmingham's financial sector. Thomas entered wearing the same sort of simple, well-made clothes that had initially misled Edward about his significance. But Edward now understood that this apparent simplicity was itself a sophisticated choice, allowing Thomas to move through Birmingham's industrial districts without attracting the kind of attention that expensive suits would generate. "Good morning, Edward." "Inspector Morrison." Thomas nodded to both men with the easy courtesy of someone who had long ago transcended the need to assert authority through display. "Thomas," Morrison replied. "I was just updating Edward on tomorrow's arrangements. Everything's proceeding smoothly." "Excellent. The Sheffield partnership should prove beneficial for everyone involved." Thomas settled into the remaining chair with his characteristic economy of movement. "Edward, I wanted to discuss the London Banking Consortium's invitation." Edward had received the invitation 3 days earlier, a proposal from a group of London financial institutions to participate in a large-scale infrastructure financing project. The consortium was seeking regional partners with expertise in industrial development, and Birmingham's remarkable track record had attracted their attention. "It's a significant opportunity," Edward said carefully. "The scale of financing involved would be unprecedented for this region." Thomas nodded. "And it represents an expansion of our coordination model to a much larger stage. London's industrial development has been fragmented, inefficient, too many competing interests, insufficient long-term planning." Edward understood immediately. The London Consortium's invitation wasn't just an opportunity for Birmingham's banks to participate in larger projects. It was an invitation to export their coordination model to England's financial capital. The complexity would be enormous, Edward observed. London's financial institutions are much more established, more independent. "Indeed," Thomas agreed, "which is why they need partners who understand how coordination can benefit everyone involved." "Your role would be significant, Edward. You'd be representing not just First National Bank, but Birmingham's entire approach to regional development." Edward felt the weight of the opportunity settling around him like a well-tailored coat. 6 months ago, he had been a successful regional banker with limited horizons. Now he was being offered the chance to help reshape England's entire financial landscape. Inspector Morrison stood to leave. "I'll let you gentlemen discuss the details. Thomas, the security arrangements for your London meetings are in place as requested." After Morrison departed, Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "Edward, I want you to understand something important. What we've accomplished in Birmingham is remarkable, but it's also fragile. Success attracts attention, and not all of that attention is benevolent. Expanding to London means operating in a more complex environment, with more sophisticated competition." Edward nodded, understanding the implications. You're talking about people who won't appreciate having their existing arrangements disrupted. I'm talking about people who've built their power on maintaining inefficiency and conflict, Thomas replied, who profit from the kind of fragmented, competitive approach that Birmingham has moved beyond. They'll resist coordination because coordination threatens their advantages. Edward looked out at Birmingham's thriving industrial landscape, understanding that what they had built here was more than just financial success. It was a demonstration that business, government, and civic institutions could work together for mutual benefit rather than engage in destructive competition. "What do you need from me?" Edward asked, and realized he was no longer asking out of obligation or fear, but from genuine commitment to an approach that had proven itself through results. Thomas smiled, and Edward saw in that expression something he had never expected to find in the mysterious figure who had walked into his office 6 months earlier. Respect for Edward as a genuine partner in an enterprise that had grown beyond either of their individual ambitions. "I need you to be exactly what you've become," Thomas said simply. "A banker who understands that true power comes not from controlling others, but from creating systems where everyone's success contributes to a larger prosperity. The London Consortium doesn't know they're inviting revolution into their midst. They think they're simply recruiting a successful regional partner." Edward stood and walked to his window one final time, looking out at the city that had become both his responsibility and his achievement. The smokestacks that had once seemed like symbols of industrial chaos now appeared as evidence of coordinated purpose. The workers moving through the streets weren't just individual laborers pursuing their own survival, but participants in an economic system that had been designed to provide stability and opportunity for everyone involved. "When do we begin?" Edward asked, turning back to Thomas with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his true calling. Thomas rose from his chair, extending his hand in a gesture that sealed not just an agreement, but a partnership that would reshape more than either man could yet imagine. "We began 6 months ago," Thomas replied, his grip firm and steady. "Tomorrow, we simply expand our definition of what's possible." Outside Edward's office, Birmingham hummed with the productive energy of a city that had learned to harness competition for cooperation, conflict for coordination, and individual ambition for collective prosperity. And in the distance, the train lines that connected Birmingham to London carried more than just goods and passengers. They carried the seeds of a transformation that would soon reshape the very foundations of English finance and industry. The coal dust had long since settled, but its message remained clear. Sometimes the greatest power appears in the simplest forms, and the most profound revolutions begin with the quietest conversations between men who understand that true strength comes not from standing above others, but from lifting everyone to higher ground. In his leather chair, Edward Carmichael smiled and began preparing for the most important meeting of his life, not as a banker serving hidden masters, but as an architect of a new kind of prosperity that would benefit not just the powerful, but everyone wise enough to join the coordination that was reshaping the world, one carefully planned decision at a time. The story of Birmingham's transformation was complete, but the larger story, the story of what happened when sophisticated coordination met London's entrenched chaos, was just beginning, and Edward Carmichael, once a proud but limited regional banker, was now prepared to help write that next chapter, as a true partner in an enterprise that promised to redefine power itself. The grandfather clock in his office chimed noon, marking not just the passage of time, but the beginning of an entirely new era in English finance, an era where the coal dust of honest work would prove more valuable than all the silk ties and Persian rugs that had once defined success in a simpler, smaller world.